Welcome, everyone. My name is Cullen Hendricks, and I'm a professor here at the Korbel School of International Studies. I'm also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. And for the next couple of years, I'm a specially appointed professor at Hiroshima University. 2 weeks ago, the Office of the United States Director of National Intelligence released Global Trends 2040. Since 1997, these global trends reports, which are produced every 4 years for each incoming or returning presidential administration, are designed to provide a framework for policymakers as they craft national security strategy and navigate an uncertain future. The report this time identifies 4 big picture structural forces that will shape our future, including demographic shifts, a changing environment and global economic outlook, and finally, advances in technology that will shape US and really the global security environment for the next 20 years. And it also provides 5 distinct scenarios or potential futures as guideposts for what that environment might look like. Today, we're going to be offering some initial impressions of the document, what it says about the challenges that lay ahead, what factors will drive global security discussions, and what it reveals about the changing security landscape and national priorities of the United States. To do so, we've impaneled a truly fantastic set of experts. I'm joined today by my Korbel colleagues first, Deborah Avant and Jonathan Moyer. Debbie is the C. Chao Kang Chair and Director of the C. Chao Kang Center for International Security and Diplomacy. And she is a renowned expert on global security and governance issues and has really shaped the way IR scholars and practitioners, frankly, think about how governance is provided, both by states, but also by transnational and non-state actors. Jonathan is an assistant professor and director of the Pardee Center for International Futures, which develops and uses the International Futures, or IFS, structured modeling tool to explore, understand, and shape alternative futures of global change and human development. Jonathan and the Pardee Center more widely have helped organizations ranging from the US government to the United Nations environmental and development programs think systematically about the future to facilitate long-range planning and thinking. And finally, we are honored to be joined today by Aaron Sikorski. Aaron is the Deputy Director of the Center for Climate and Security and the Director of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Prior to those positions, she served as the Deputy Director of the Strategic Futures Group on the National Intelligence Council in the United States here, where she co-authored the Quadrennial Global Trends Report and led the US intelligence community's environmental and climate security analysis, which are topics that are very dear to yours truly. She is also the founding chair of the Climate Security Advisory Council, a congressionally mandated group designed to facilitate coordination between the intelligence community and US government and scientific agencies. Debbie, Jonathan, and Aaron, thank you all for being here today. So I'm going to be kicking things off with some questions for our panelists, but we encourage those of you who are joining us to be thinking of and putting questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can. If you do not wish to be identified with your question, please remember to submit your question anonymously. So Aaron, I hope I can ask you to kind of start off and set the table for us. Given your experience in the intelligence community generally and your role in Global Trends Report specifically, what is this document? Why does the US government need it? And finally, what are some of your key takeaways from this iteration? Aaron?
Sure, thanks Cullen, and thanks for hosting this panel today. It's fun to have this discussion now that Global Trends is out in the world. As you stated in your opening, right, this report comes out every 4 years since 1997, and it's meant to be a long-term strategic look at key trends and uncertainties that will shape the national security landscape, right? It's supposed to look out about 20 years into the future, and so to get policymakers and the US government out of the here and now and looking ahead at how their decisions today will impact the future. It's both a quantitative and qualitative analysis, which I think is really important to our discussion. So the analysis is rooted in rigorous data analysis and research, but then it also brings in an experiential element, right, of going out into the world and talking to people about these issues and how they're playing out in different parts of the globe. It's that William Gibson quote, right? The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And so I think that's a really important role that this document plays, as well as providing that getting us out of the research and data and into the real world. Another key part of this report is the fact that it's unclassified, right? Which allows us to have the discussion we're having today about it. And so it's not just for policymakers in the government, but it's for other countries, it's for the American people to see how intelligence folks are thinking about these issues and thinking about the shape of the world. And as I'm sure many folks on this call saw, there was plenty of press coverage when it came out a couple of weeks ago, exploring these issues. And I know previous versions of the report have been translated into multiple languages. The Chinese, the Russians, they like to take a good look at what's in the report as well. So it's a way to talk to the world about how the US is thinking about these issues. I think, one of my former colleagues on the NIC used to say that the global trends process was actually more important than the product itself. And I think that's another key point to have in our discussion today, is a lot of what the use of the report comes down to how the administration and the intelligence community will use it and its findings going forward, right? How does it shape their strategy, the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, other intelligence work going forward? I think we've already seen some promising signs with this new report. If you look at DNI Avril Haines' testimony to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence last week when she gave the annual threat assessment, if you read her opening remarks and then you read this global trends report, you see a lot of similarities there in how they frame the world, or how she framed the world and how the report frames the world, which to me suggests the piece is already having impact with this new administration. So I think it's a really important tool, and a lot of how its effects come down to how it's used, right, going forward. Very briefly on this version of the report, and I have to say here, even though I was part of the team working on this, I left in December. I in no way speak for the National Intelligence Council now and the work that they're doing. But when you look at the report itself, I think it's really interesting to see the structure, which you kind of alluded to, Cullen, but this effort to distinguish between structural forces and emerging dynamics in the more contested world. And you have just 4 structural forces at the beginning, which you enumerated. And these are meant to be forces that are easier to predict over the next 20 years, where we feel more confident in the assessment of them, and that they're things that are going to shape all aspects of the world. So climate, which I know we're going to talk about more later, but it's something that is that shaping force across all different aspects of security, policy, and risk. And then you move from those structural forces to emerging dynamics, where you look at what I always like to say, at how humans react to these structural forces, right? Whether it's within societies, within states, or at the international level. And that's where the uncertainty is. And that's where I think some of the really interesting analysis in this report is, and where there's a lot of rich discussion. And then of course the scenarios at the end, which have been a feature of many global trends reports, which kind of link all of these things together and allow policymakers to put themselves in that future world and see how these issues play out. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference with Betty Sue Flowers, who's done a lot of scenario work for Shell. She used to run UT Austin's the Johnson Library, and she's a writer. And she called scenarios stage sets, right? You want them to be rich enough that people can kind of see themselves in that world, but you don't want to give them all of the direction, right? And I think these scenarios do a nice job of kind of giving that opportunity. The last thing I'll say is that I was interested to see all the press coverage be so, and maybe not surprised, but that it painted the report as very negative. And I think that speaks to the challenge of writing such a report in a year of a pandemic, right? And not only did that upend the process, but it upended people's mindsets about the work, and people were living very personally and viscerally through such a challenge. And I think you see some of that reflected in the report, but I do think there is some hope in the report as well, which wasn't in the press coverage as much, but there are opportunities as well, which I hope we'll talk about today. So I'll stop there. But
thank you so much, Erin. I think it's really very interesting of you to highlight that even when the task in front of us is to think long range and big picture about what the future looks like, we are in fact still captives of the moment, especially one that has been, as you point out, so viscerally experienced, not just here in the United States, but obviously around the world. And we will indeed talk about how it is that we may be able to leverage some methodologies and some tools when Jonathan speaks a little bit later to hopefully take us out of that moment and make us less kind of captives thereof. My next question, I'd like to turn to Debbie here. The subtitle of this report is A More Contested World. And that's a very pointed signal about broad anticipated changes in the international system. What kind of world are we going to be looking forward to from a governance perspective? Are we in the midst of some kind of huge shift away from the US-led or at least dominated post-Cold War order? Debbie.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having the idea to get this together, Cullen. I think this is a really great panel. So I want to divide my answer to that question into two claims. One is about the report's analysis of governance problems, and the other is about its analysis of likely governance responses to the problems. So on governance problems, I see the future as probably even more challenging than the report suggests. The analysis examines these four sets of issues: demographics, the environment, economics, and technology. And it offers a pretty sobering analysis of each. But in the dynamics section, I'm not sure it does justice to the degree to which these increasingly affect one another. And let me just give you a few examples of how I think they increasingly affect one another in a kind of problematic way. First, it assumes that economic growth could allow for better capacity for investing in and dealing with challenges like climate change, which I absolutely agree with. But economic growth also creates problems having to do with climate change. Many argue that the lifestyles of the rich and endless growth are key challenges for sort of dealing with this issue. Similarly, it assumes that technology could promise innovation, and also I agree, but it also promises both economic and environmental challenges. Even as a slowdown in global travel because of the pandemic reduced carbon emissions, all of us zooming around all the time increased them. Cryptocurrency has huge environmental impacts, and that's something that's really growing in the world. And then one of the really interesting and important challenges I think we face is that clean energy, though it's a critical element in reducing carbon outputs, has significant material requirements, which also have huge environmental, economic, and security implications. So in my view, if anything, the problems facing the world, because of not only their thorniness, but their interconnectivity, are probably even greater than the report states. So on the analysis of government responses, though, I actually think the report ignores a couple of important glimmers of hope. So I'll end on kind of a hopeful note. The New York Times overview that I know we were tweeting around says that the report finds at the same time that populations are increasingly empowered and demanding more, governments are coming under greater pressure from new challenges and more limited resources. This widening gap portends more political volatility, erosion of democracy, and expanding roles for alternative providers of governance. So I really want to focus on the alternative providers of governance. And I first want to acknowledge that the National Intelligence Council and the people behind this report have done a lot for many years in trying to incorporate non-state actors in all of their vestiges into the report. But I do think that the report underplays the potential for non-state actors to nudge governments in more useful directions and to nudge all of us in more useful governance directions. So there's a bit of an awkwardness in the report between, on the one hand, acknowledging the contributions of non-state actors, including companies and NGOs, as well as state and local governments, as potential partners or substitutes for governments. But on the other hand, as still analyzing states for the most part as unitary actors on which governance rests. And I think this is most obvious in the analysis of China. There's a huge focus on China as a rival, but there are elements of the Chinese population, of Chinese industry, and even of different levels of Chinese government that could be partners in potential governance global solutions. So too strong of assumptions about Chinese rivalry, I think, can blind US policymakers to opportunities for collaboration with different parts. This unitary language also inhibits, I think, imagination in the section on international governance, focusing on what governments as unitary actors are likely to do takes analysis away from the dynamics at work in different countries and the different directions they could go. And for an illustration, I just want people to think about the difference of, if you were another country, looking at the United States as a unitary actor under President Trump versus under President Biden. What you might expect from the US could be quite different. If thinking about the future, I think it's more productive to target the underlying dynamics in the US and recognize that different parts within the US may be important allies on different issues. For instance, many state governments, including California and Colorado, pushed back against national policies when the Trump administration targeted illegal immigrants, as did many companies. But right now, different state governments have targeted voting rights and/or members of the transgender community, and companies are pushing back, this time in alignment with the national government. So these different kinds of coalitions, I think, are something that we ought to be paying attention to. And then lastly, on this non-state actor point, even though the report mentions a possibility that they can cooperate or compete with states on governance, it doesn't mention the way that non-state actors can actually nudge states toward a different attitude about their interests, and leading states sometimes to be more productive in their practices and norms. And Tim Profeta, actually, in a event that we had just yesterday here on Biden's climate agenda, pushed exactly this point, saying he used to think of states as, sort of either before or, sort of as governance experiments. But in fact, he's talked about state and local governments and industry as being really important for keeping the pressure on the national government, even as the national government is also making policies that are affecting them. So it's key for the ratcheting up effect to imagine this dynamic between the two, in which their interests aren't always the same, but actually change because of this dynamic. So the second glimmer of hope that I think the report underplays is the productive potential of contestation. So it assumes a contested world will be dangerous, but competition can sometimes push in positive directions as well. And in a Twitter thread just a few days ago, a climate analyst, Lori Virta, suggested that US competition with China could actually push toward rather than away from global solutions. According to her, and I'll quote, the best things the US can do to encourage China on climate: one, going big on climate action and building world-leading low-carbon industries and businesses at home; two, building momentum among other countries; and three, providing bigger, cleaner alternatives to the Belt and Road in the developing world. So not only are states not the only actors, but cooperation among states is not the only avenue toward productive action. Sometimes contestation can actually lend to more productive action as well. Finally, I'm not suggesting that non-state actors always push in a useful direction or that contestation always leads to productivity, but understanding when it does and when it doesn't is critical. And here, I'm really going to point to a very important point in the document on page 93 that begins to get at this dynamic. It says the countries and non-state actors that are best able to harness and integrate material capabilities with relationships, network centrality, and resiliency will have the most meaningful and sustainable influence globally. I think that point, combined with the importance of non-state actors and the beneficial potential of contestation, suggests some different outcomes for the scenarios. At any given issue, there are many potential partners. There could be competition in some areas and cooperation in others. In this situation, actors may fall less easily into quote unquote good guy and bad guy camps. And you see some of that in the competitive coexistence scenario, where the US and China cooperate on economics and compete in other areas. But this competitive coexistence could generate creative competition where the two are contending to build productive relationships. But it could also develop very unproductive competition where the two are actually focused on undermining each other. Similarly, the tragedy and mobilization scenario, where global disasters lead like-minded state and non-state actors to mobilize, could inspire new action and democratic practices among a consortia of governments. or it could weaponize information and connections in a way that could be very dangerous. The more beneficial relations in both of the scenarios, according to the point I read above, seem to depend less on a strong great power to force actors into compliance and more on actors' recognitions that more relationships will generate greater centrality and resilience and the need for meaningful influence. And I wish there were a little bit more attention in the report to how this recognition happens. So in sum, yeah, I think this is a very important, if somewhat depressing report that probably is not depressing enough on some of the problems we face and maybe not quite imaginative enough on the potential for governance responses.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Those were really masterful remarks. And I think, one of the things that really kind of is striking as I reflect on what you've had to say is that, for a document that tries to envision kind of the dynamism that is going to emerge out of technological innovation, we know that technology does not innovate particularly well in markets that are dominated by a single or maybe just a couple large kind of actors, right? And so there may be kind of an analogous situation emerging in the governance space where this type of more competitive environment spurs much more innovation, not just in terms of the outcomes of the technological races, but in fact of governance structures as well. So I'd like to shift to talking or to asking Jonathan a question right now. And I think Debbie's remarks really highlight the fact that thinking about the future in a structured way is really difficult. And it's difficult because you not only have to identify significant drivers, but you also have to think about all of these complex myriad interactions between different actors at different scales, both in terms of scales of actors and also temporally. So Jonathan, could you talk a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities that arise when you're attempting to think in this kind of structured way about the future? We used to, here at the Korbel School, have a class that was called the Art of Forecasting, which kind of implied that forecasting and scenario development were at least equal parts art and social science. Is that how you see the enterprise? Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Colin, and thanks to my fellow panelists, and thanks for organizing this. I think it's a great event, and I think the report is a tremendous contribution to global thinking about the next 2 decades. And so I'm really excited to be here to talk about it. So how do we think about the future from a structured perspective, and what are the trade-offs, and how do we think about what kinds of tools might be useful? So the Party Center, which is a research center that I am the director of, develops a tool called the International Future System. And the IF system is a class of models called integrated assessment models that looks at the interactions of large systems around the world, quantifies that on a country basis, and projects long-term development. So we're interested in what does the future look like over long time horizons across issues like human development, environmental sustainability, governance. So really kind of a perspective that can hopefully shed some light on thinking about how to interpret this global trends report. Sometimes you interact with people who say the future's not knowable. Right, we can't know what's going to happen. It's completely unpredictable. And I think there's a real truth to that, because the future is certainly not deterministic. Like, it's not something, this isn't some big clock that's wound and we just push it forward and kind of have some easily predicted future space. But it's a really untrue thing to say in other ways, because there are things that we have really significant knowability about. And this report's framed around that. It starts with looking at these structural issues, and it focuses on demographics, economics, the environment, and technology. So these structural factors are, I think they should form kind of the backbone of any future analysis framework. And then on top of that, we can layer different kinds of uncertainties and nuances and dynamics. And I think the structure of this report is kind of beautifully framed from that perspective. So let's talk about the structural piece first. So what do we know about the future? What's knowable and what's not knowable? I think about knowability in the future by thinking about, first of all, what can we measure? What can we measure well that persists across time? So demographics is a great example of a knowable kind of future trajectory. But these kinds of knowable future trends exist in lots of other areas as well. Aspects of education, aspects of improving economic well-being, thinking about capital accumulation or the development of infrastructure. there are values that represent a certain kind of persistent shift that changes across time. So culture can also be thought of in these terms. Often these persistent trends that we measure well, we think about as stocks. So we think about as things that move slowly and that have more of a resilient character. And that, I think, is what tools like integrated assessment models can provide to this longer term analytic structure. I think we know more about the longer term future than we think we do. And I think that we tend to be focused on the uncertainty, and we tend to be focused on the dynamics, because these are the aspects of the future that are deeply uncertain, and that uncertainty can really characterize our future well-being by shaping things in ways that are unanticipated. So it makes a lot of sense that we're focused on this uncertainty. I was glad to hear Aaron, in your comments earlier, suggest that maybe the report, or at least some of the interpretation of the report, was a little more pessimistic than one might expect. The body of the report did have a lot of positive descriptions of a future world characterized by improving human well-being, for example. So I think that's there. The executive summary, I think, tended to focus a little more on the negative side of things. But some aspects of future development I would point to: the future education. Like the future of educational attainment around the world, we should expect to see it grow from about, on average today, about 7.5 years globally to closer to 9 years over the next 20 years. Future incomes, these we expect to grow as well across time, and also see improvements like reducing poverty. This does have trade-offs, like Debbie's suggesting, with environmental systems, but we also see this increase in renewable energy diffusion and a real growth curve there that's going to hopefully shift our reliance on fossil fuels and its effect on climate change over the long term as well. So my position would be that there are deep structures that we can forecast and understand, but then on top of that, we really have to layer the scenario analysis, the uncertainties, what others have called the art of this. I think of it less as an art and more of it as qualitative social science, which is, I mean, if that's an art, then that's fine, but it's also an art that's underpinned by rigorous methodology as well. So I'm happy to continue talking about this and any of our modeling work. And if anyone's interested, our modeling work is all free and open source. So you can go online and use it yourself if you're interested. But
that's a great point, Jonathan. I mean, I think that if you don't like the scenarios that you have in front of you, the IFS tool gives you a way to actually manipulate some of these things. So those budding security specialists out there and people who are thinking about the long range future, this may be a tool that will be useful for you to leverage. I was just reflecting on this kind of disconnect, Jonathan, that you identified in terms of the overall tenor of the report and what it says about human development, and then perhaps the more glum or somber tone that you would take away from the executive summary. And I think that one of the ways that we can imagine something like that co-occurring is that there is a real difference between the outlook for humanity over the next 20 years, broadly defined, and the outlook for a country, and frankly for a national security community that has grown over the last several decades relatively accustomed to seeing itself as kind of the lone superpower. So it may be that the difference between the outcomes in the aggregate and the outcomes for any specific country, the United States in particular, may be driving some of the dissonance of tone there. Aaron, you and I have both spent a lot of time thinking about the security implications of climate change, and they loom relatively large in this document. I'd say more so than any previous global trends report. Given your experience over the years leading the U.S. intelligence community's environmental and climate security analysis, what are the key factors that have made climate change a much bigger part of this picture?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think, first of all, I did count, and there are more pages dedicated to climate change in this report than any previous global trend. So if page count matters, we're definitely there. I think there are a couple of reasons why it looms larger than ever before. One is that it's just become so visceral and inescapable, right? I mean, it's not a future threat, it's here in many parts of the world. And when you do the research and you talk to people, it's something that comes up in conversation after conversation as shaping the environment. So it's very tangible now. I also think it's due to some academic work by you and others who have looked at this issue and really drawn out the linkages between climate change and security risks that have helped shape an understanding of it that hasn't existed previously. I was speaking earlier today on a different panel and just saying, I feel like we're in a moment where there's been kind of a step change in understanding climate security risks away from just thinking about physical risks to military installations, right, as the defining issue, but more of a systemic risk that's really shaping the landscape overall. So I think that that has just been a shift, and that's reflected in this report in such a way. I think also the non-state actor role that Debbie mentioned earlier in nudging governments and shaping the debate has been huge on climate, and something that absolutely needs to be taken into account. I think one thing the report does really well is getting into the second and third order security risks of climate as well, in a way that I find really useful for understanding and shaping the discussion. And I'd love to kick it over to you, Cullen, to touch on your research on this a little bit more. But I wanted to add one thing that Debbie brought up that I think is so important related to China and the unitary actor issue that I've been thinking a lot about climate lately, and I think it's relevant to this conversation, is watching the internal debate play out in China right now around coal use, and how you have these different factions, between the scientists, frankly, and those who want to push coal for industry's sake. I just think that's so fascinating, and that it's happening on the global stage and out in the open, and we can look at it. And I think that speaks to the importance of understanding what's going on beneath the surface with some of these key actors, and there are opportunities there that weren't addressed in the report. So sorry for that tangent, but I just wanted to bring that up because I think it's so critical. But Cullen, let's hear from you a little bit on this.
Sure, and just picking up on that last thread, I actually don't think that that's tangential at all, because I think that one of the, when we think about the second and third order effects, China is a fascinating place to be analyzing from that perspective. Just for our friends out there, a little factoid for you to take home today: about half of all the refined silica that's necessary for making solar panels, right? So about half of all of that material that is vital to powering the sustainable energy transition comes from Xinjiang, China, which, as we all know, is the locus of one of the most significant and frankly dreadful campaigns of human rights abuses that's occurring anywhere in the world right now. And it's occurring there in large part because it requires a lot of energy, in particular cheap energy, and much of that energy is coming from coal. So that is just one little part of the world that can tell us something about the complexities of these kind of first, second, and then third order effects that you were alluding to earlier. I guess I would kind of flag, I think, two other things that may have really kind of raised the profile of climate change as an issue in this document. And I think that that's probably salutary, but I think that it's important to put both of these issues in context. The first is that we are living in the shadow of a narrative around the Syrian civil war, which is one of the greatest humanitarian crises of our time, that is deeply affected by the discourse around climate change. Even more so than the conflict in Darfur, maybe a decade earlier, the discourse at the highest levels of U.S. government, including President Obama and Senator and former Secretary Kerry, who now is our sort of climate czar. I don't usually like to use the term czar here, but I mean, I think that that's essentially the role that he's being asked to play in a lot of ways. Both of them have alluded to the fact that climate change in the Fertile Crescent was catalytic in this once in several 100-year drought that many have taken as being very, very central to the narrative of why the Syrian civil war occurred in the first place, triggering massive displacement, discontent at the lack of economic opportunities in urban areas, provoking what began as a peaceful resistance movement, and ultimately, because of repressive government acts, became this internationalized civil war that has drawn in major regional powers, but also sort of global superpowers. So I think that that's a really important part of that discussion. And the other one, and this gets us all the way back to where you began in terms of thinking about the way that COVID has shaped our understanding, or it shaped the discussion in this document, is that COVID, I think, has really refocused the energy of this community around deep thinking about what are fundamentally kind of actorless threats. And so if you think about a very traditional kind of paradigm for national security, it's primarily oriented towards identifying and deterring or neutralizing the threats that are posed by kind of conventional armed actors, be they state-based actors, Iran, North Korea from the US perspective, or non-state actors like Boko Haram or something like that in West Africa. And the United States national security community, intelligence communities are pretty darn good at that. And they have at their disposal a toolkit to facilitate kind of deterrence and compellence that is unrivaled in human history in terms of its potential destructive power. But it turns out that when we're facing these kind of more diffuse kind of actorless threats, COVID being one of them, but climate change being another, SEAL Team 6, right, the Fifth Fleet, the nuclear triad, they're not particularly useful for addressing these types of problems. And so I think that COVID really drew that into relief, because COVID has claimed more lives in the United States than I think actually at this point it's probably all of our wars except for the Civil War. And so, you know, it is recasting our perspective in terms of the way we think about threats around one where those threats don't necessarily have a name, they don't necessarily operate using armed tactics, and they're not kind of actor-centric. And so I think it's actually, in that sense, it's a bit captive of the moment, but it may be captive in a somewhat productive manner, because it's caused us to really rethink the distinction between kind of human security domestically and national security, which I think is productive. So thank you for kicking that back to me. And excuse me, I think speaking of that capacity, I think there was just a low altitude flyover of a couple of military jets here. All right, so at this point, I want to have a little bit of fun with this. Now, none of us have crystal balls, at least I don't think we do, nor can we, you know, kind of anticipate many of the unknowns that might come down the pike. With that said, I'd like each panelist very quickly to say to sort of identify, do you think that there's something missing here? Like, what might be a hole? Are there parts of the picture that are missing, or things that surprised you? And I'll go ahead and start first with that. All of the scenarios that we've been discussing assume a politically stable, if not economically somewhat moribund, China. And while I personally probably wouldn't short Chinese stock anytime soon, I do think it's pretty interesting that in this document, the worst case assumption for China is basically the middle income trap, right? Where it gets old before it can get truly wealthy. And this causes it to have a variety of domestic problems in terms of sustaining its trajectory of economic growth. But China faces, I think, you know, real challenges, both domestically in terms of its rural-urban divide, the crackdowns and grave human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and its aging population, which I alluded to, but also abroad with its ambitions in the South China Sea and rising tensions there, its ambitions in Central Asia and Jammu Kashmir, and increasingly in the Arctic with its ambition to be an Arctic nation. And a growing expectation that as the United States is in a period of relative economic and political decline in the international system, a growing expectation that China is going to begin shouldering more of the burden to provide global public goods, or at least to coordinate the provision of global public goods. So yeah, I don't think that that's a very likely outcome, but if the Global Trends Report had been around in 1989 for the Bush Senior administration, I suspect it would have been useful, given the way that history played out, if at least one of those scenarios had envisioned the rapid decline and the fragmenting of the Soviet Union. So with that, I'll kick it back to Debbie to start us off. Was there something in here that surprised you?
Wow. So yeah, let me actually take, I think the scenario you pose about China is a really interesting one. And I think that one of the things that's really important to address, and I guess it surprised me in some sense because it was actually included to a certain degree in the report, is the same kind of concern about sort of the potential future for the United States. I think that, you know, to some degree, there's been a bit of a, you know, for good reason, hesitancy for national intelligence folks to look inside the United States. But as polarization grew, you know, more and more people said, you know, we have to sort of look at these issues. And I do think that the report notes the importance of polarization among democracies, including the United States. And I think the issue of even what we're talking about, you know, sort of climate change, I completely agree with Erin. It seems like we're in a different mode in some ways. But then that leads me to even be more shocked to hear people still talking about resistance to it, resistance to the very idea. And I think that we need to, so I guess if I were sort of thinking about where the US were going to fall in a sort of future scenario, paying attention to just what is going to happen in the United States and whether, I think the likelihood of coming to sort of consensus in the US on many of these issues is not great. And so this issue of productive versus unproductive contestation, I think is going to be really important. Under what conditions can we recognize that different parties are going to come together on different issues and invoke a more productive contestation among the many different perspectives in the United States? Because I think that will be critical, again, to how the US falls, but also the US is a huge part of the world. I think we saw that in the last year when it didn't play the role that many hoped it would with respect to the pandemic, with problematic outcomes. I think the United States can be a productive player, and if it doesn't have productive contestation at home, it's going to be hard for it to be productive abroad.
Thank you, Debbie. Jonathan, you spend a lot of time gazing into and tinkering with crystal balls. So what's missing or what's hazy in the forecast here?
So first of all, I think you could argue that this is a wildly optimistic report written during a pandemic. So I'll put that aside. And what the criticism I'm providing is not directed at the people who ran this, because I think it's a really successful thing. But I would point to two things. One is the thing I pointed to earlier, which is this improvement in human development. So if you ignore the short-term pandemic, which is hard to do, we're in the middle of it. I mean, all projections suggest that an additional 50 to 100 million people might be thrown into extreme poverty, 100 million people thrown into undernutrition. There's a real gendered effect of this. It's going to affect people in the vulnerable will be made more vulnerable in some way. So not to neglect any of that real true human suffering, but the long-term development trajectories, the stocks, the dynamics that have existed for many decades and will continue to exist, will see rapid growth and development in the global South. It has the potential to really recenter the global South in this global conversation about what matters. And I think that's important for all the things Debbie's bringing up with state, non-state actor kinds of issues and all the dynamics that the report highlights as well. So that's one thing. There's a real positive story that's in pieces in the report, but like I think really could be drawn out as well. Again, it's written during a global pandemic, so like that's a pretty weak criticism. The second bit of feedback is, and this isn't deeply critical because it's emerging research basically, but what's the effect of the pandemic on inequality? There's some emerging research that suggests that the effect of the pandemic on inequality is going to be to hit the middle class. You all remember that elephant graph, the income effect from 2008, where in high income country, lower middle class groups were affected. And this led to like a significant, people speculated or argued that it led to a big driver of the backlash against global institutions, elites, democratic institutions, right? It was this nativist backlash that we're still to a degree experiencing. You could argue that the global pandemic is going to have a similar effect on middle class related folks, maybe in the global north to a degree, but potentially in the global south to a significant degree. You have a real possibility of people who 20, 30 years ago, their parents might have lived in a significant kind of poverty space, who have developed into more of a middle class existence that's service economy based, and COVID has decimated this space. The longer term effects of this may be really, really significant, and things that even a crystal ball isn't going to help you much with. And unfortunately, my crystal ball is broken. It's always been broken and very hazy, which is why I feel the need to rely on these quantitative structural tools to just get a handle on what may or may not be happening. But I want to thank all of you again, if that's my last comment.
Thank you, Jonathan. And yeah, I'll go ahead and throw on my political economy kind of hat for a second to pick up on this issue related to inequality. One of the big things that we haven't talked about yet is the discussion in the document about changes in technology, including automation and the development of artificial intelligence, that are kind of going to put on steroids a process of what is economists refer to as skills-biased technological change that has already been occurring. And that is one of the very significant explanations for why inequality seems to be widening, because it is skills-biased technological change is just a fancy way of saying that automation and artificial intelligence are turning a lot of what used to be formerly middle-class jobs that would sustain middle-class lifestyles into automated processes. And so there is this very, very, very kind of robust discussion about the future of work, in no small part because the future of work determines how people feel in large part about their prospects for living a life that is as good or better than their parents. And as the second order effect of that being the way in which those kind of beliefs about those prospects play out for political stability. If you are frustrating the ambitions of what had been a rising global lower middle class about the future continuation of that trajectory, it's going to put immense pressure on the governments of these countries that are most affected by this to come up with answers. And it's going to be occurring in a macroeconomic environment, I suspect, in which they will have fewer tools at their disposal to really affect change there. Jonathan, you look like you want to jump back in on this.
Do you mind? Because I think this is something I totally agree with, but there's also a trend that I think was missing a bit, which is government revenue. If you look at, so the dynamics you're talking about too aren't necessarily things that would not lead to increases in government capabilities to respond to these things as well. So one of the pieces I thought might be missing in the report too is, I mean, if you look at our projections, government revenue as a share of the global population has doubled over the previous 30 years. And we project that it's going to double again over the next 20 years. So this, I mean, I don't know how you feel about the state, but if you think that the state and a capable state can provide good and respond to these collective action problems, then that's the positive dynamic that I would bring in as well. But I'm not to disagree, Colin, with you, just to flavor it in a different way.
No, I think that that's a great point to raise. I think that what I would underscore though is that even in consistent with those projections, there will be still a high degree of inequality across governments in terms of their ability to raise revenue, in part because the liberalizing trade regimes that most developing countries have been pursuing took away one of their easiest ways of generating government revenue in the form of kind of what you might call port taxes. Okay, enough kind of political economy inside baseball for the moment. Before we turn to Aaron, I would just like to remind you all folks that we have a few minutes left, about 12, and that the Q&A is open. There's some interesting questions in there. If you have questions for our panelists, either individually or as a group, be sure to get them in there. Thanks. Aaron.
Sure,
So,
and I'll keep it brief.
I'm putting you in the opposition of having to be somewhat self-critical here.
I know, but it's a good position to be in. There are three things I would say. One is Debbie already covered the look at the United States, and obviously this is a hard issue for the intelligence community to manage, but you can't understand the future without understanding what's going on in the U.S. So that should be in there. A second issue is the future of education, which I think is touched on a little bit, but not as much as it could be, and I think that would really help bring some richness to the discussion. And the last thing, and this is a challenge of the project writ large, is because it's a different team that writes the report most every time. But the previous report, Paradox of Progress, I thought did an amazing job looking at the changing nature of power and how that was developing around the world. And I think an effort to take that analysis forward and kind of evaluate where we are now 4 years on and kind of how we see that shaping would be useful as well, and is not as much in this report as I think it could be or needs to be, to kind of build on the start that was there in Paradox of Progress, which was amazing, and then go forward. But I think that's more of a structural issue of how the project itself is developed, and maybe something to think about in the future is how do you build connections between the various reports as you go.
Great, thank you so much, Aaron. All right, let's go ahead and turn to questions from the audience. So our first question comes to us from Jordan Beauregard. Hi, Jordan, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Jordan asks, to what degree is the welfare of humanity actually separate from national security?
I'm happy to start on that one. I think they're not, and I think that's part of the changing nature of the discussion of what constitutes national security and how do we frame it. And the things we heard, like I mentioned earlier, from D.N.I. Haynes and others, I'm not a fan of separating human security necessarily from national security in discussions, because I think it by it automatically makes human security less somehow than national security. And as Cullen laid out with the actorless threats, I think we're just in a different space and need different terminology. And I don't know that we're really there yet in how to describe it, but welcome other thoughts on that.
Any of our other panelists want to jump in on
Yeah,
that?
I
Because
have to jump in
I would
here.
just wind up echoing what Aaron said. Yeah, Debbie, please.
Yeah, no, I think what Aaron said is so important. And you know, there's been a big debate in the security field for my entire career about these different definitions of security. And I think that Truth in Advertising, edited a journal for about 5 years, starting in 2016, about that looked. Its whole mission was to try to connect those different conversations together. And I think in the last year, we have seen how critical that is. If the United States ignores the human security of some of its citizens, there are huge implications for how the US exists on the global stage. And the way in which these kind of actorless threats affect people is really important for, you know, how secure they feel, no matter whether troops are coming over the border or not. And so I think that there is, you know, I have seen in the last year a lot more of a kind of productive beginning of a conversation among security analysts who are like scrambling to try to, you know, find readings on race to put in their classes and to sort of think about how to integrate these issues. And I think that's incredibly important for moving forward. So I think it's really important. I think we're not quite there yet, but I think that that's where we have to go.
Thank you, Debbie. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. Consistent with the concern about government revenues, to what extent do the panelists foresee government debt or debt crises as being a major driver of instability, particularly in middle-income countries? I can actually just briefly start on that. I think that is something that comes up in the report, and also comes out of, I think, the expectation that in the aftermath of COVID, there are in fact going to be pretty significant inflationary concerns that are coming on the heels of both the expansionary monetary policy that's been pursued during the crisis, but really is part of at this point, a decade or longer period of expansionary kind of monetary policy as a means of trying to get out of some of the problems related to the financial crisis, right? One of the last global crises that we faced, which seems like ancient history, but was really only about a decade ago. And I think that the way that the question is phrased is accurate, because at some point it is going to be more difficult for developing and middle income countries to borrow, both in terms of financing the kind of the structural investments in education and infrastructure that Jonathan was talking about earlier, but also to borrow to address kind of short-term crises. And so if you think about that as basically closing a little bit of the policy space in terms of the options that are available to middle-income countries and developing countries, in terms of, say, responding to issues like high food and fuel prices, right? Or responding to issues such as downturns in the global economy or contractions in a particular country's major export markets, right? If there's less space for the government to respond, but there isn't a huge change in the degree to which the citizens hold the government accountable for responding, then the gap between what is expected and what can be actualized is likely to be a significant source of instability. And I think that we saw that, kind of a dry run for that, frankly, in the Arab Spring. So that's how I feel about it. Does anybody else want to jump in on that one?
I think your view is really interesting, and I totally agree that that's a very useful perspective. The way I would think about it is, it's a very much an it depends question. And when I think about the long-term effect of debt, you have to think about the system in which debt operates globally. So, if debt's operating from a transparent perspective, where you're thinking about payoffs and you're thinking about like structured relationships that make sense over the long run, then you're trading off kind of future consumption for current consumption. So it's a question of debt for what? And if you're investing in useful projects now, which is a real hand-wavy kind of way to talk about it. But if you're doing that, then it can be absolutely a useful thing. So for middle-income countries, I think the threat is moderate to low. For poor and vulnerable countries, I think the threat is much greater. And you have in our analysis, there are about 30 countries around the world that are unlikely to achieve any of the global development goals. So these countries are like the most vulnerable countries. They're susceptible to debt that can be leveraged for geopolitical gains. So Chinese debt is an interesting kind of thing to think about in this kind of context. But so it's a really complicated question that moderate to low is a real hand wavy way to kind of walk around.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Excuse me. So this question comes from Rob Bayless. How do we ensure that the hard shift, to renewable energy, how do we keep that from being economically negatively impactful on the poor in the United States and worldwide?
Can I just jump in real quick and then others can jump in? I really think you have to think about this in supply and demand terms and in sequencing terms. So if you have 800 million people who live on less than $1.90 a day, the transition to renewable energy is not the immediate concern. The immediate concern is food, shelter, kids going to school, infant mortality, health services, like really basic, like on the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you think about this in the US, I do think it's going to be an important and interesting question. The question of how do you transition people who are, who's have a tighter income space and where fossil fuels do present a really easable kind of fungible energy source, and moving to something that's higher technology oriented could be challenging. I have no answers for that one, but I do think, but in terms of the global question, from a supply demand perspective, I think it's important to think of what are the real priorities for different levels of income, and renewable energy for the bottom billion, for example, I don't think is the priority, even though USAID in the US has its goal to electrify all of Africa, and that has a big renewable energy component as well. So.
Debbie, do you have any thoughts on this one?
It's funny, as Jonathan was talking, I was remembering, this is not talking about clean energy particularly, but I was remembering we had some property in Africa a while ago, and we had someone who stayed in our property, kind of raised his family there, but was, essentially, keeping track of, taking care of our property. And one year he wanted us not to pay him in money, but to send him a cell phone. And this person wanted to have a cell phone because he was illiterate, and yet with a cell phone, he could do his own banking without relying on intermediaries. And this person who was illiterate could figure out how to redo the cell phone we sent him so it worked in the system in Mozambique, where he was. And so I think that sometimes renewable energy and these different technological advances can play in really different ways than we imagine, and can allow kind of leapfrogging type of impacts. And so I would just encourage us not to be sort of set in how we think that these kinds of things will play out in the world.
And I would only pick up on that and go all the way back to where Debbie started in her comments about kind of competitive coexistence, which is that if the United States, China, and the European Union get really serious about competing on innovation in the green, it's going to drive down the cost of those things to the point where they will be cost competitive as a first best kind of option, even for developing countries. Folks, this has been a fascinating conversation. An hour went by awful quickly. Thank you so very much for having joined us. Thanks again to the C Center and the Pardee Center for having sponsored this event and provided all of the back-end kind of support for it. Thank you to the folks who are providing that. And then I also just want to thank individually Aaron for joining us today for this discussion. This is a great report. I look forward to seeing what you do as the Center for Climate and Security develops moving forward. And to all of you who are joining us, wherever you may be joining us from, thank you for having spent time with us. Have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you so much.